This began a few days before last year's Super Bowl. The cable box in our living room had been cutting in and out for almost a month. Under normal conditions, I wouldn't have paid much attention to it. I don't watch much television these days, even football. Besides, it worked most of the time, but my wife had invited some people over from work to have a Super Bowl party. I learned long ago if I keep the wife happy, she'll leave me alone to fiddle around in the wood shop. I called into the cable company earlier in the week and made an appointment for after lunch on Thursday. When the day came, the repairman showed up right before the family was going to sit down for dinner. For a moment, I thought I saw smoke coming out of my wife's ears. There are a few things she hates more. I knew better not to say a word. After I showed the guy the location of the TV, we sat down to eat. After a quick meal, I retreated to the living room to watch the cable guy and help if needed. He checked the box first and then moved on to the cables. He asked for access to the attic, and I led him to the hall and lowered the stairs. About 10 minutes later, he returned with a frayed section of cable. It appeared that some critter had been chewing on it. Once he replaced it, everything was fine. I thanked him, and he asked to use the restroom before he left. I said sure and pointed him in the direction of it. My son and I were in front of the TV, fiddling with the channels for a while before I remembered the repair guy was still on the john. I didn't want to badger the fella, but he'd been in there for a really long time, so just to be safe, I politely knocked on the door and asked if all was well. No reply came, but a few seconds later I heard a man's voice echoing from my daughter's bedroom. Naturally, I was curious and leaned over to peek in. The repairman was talking to my daughter at the connecting door. This scene slightly peeved me, but it seemed innocent enough. He was a young kid after all, but she was barely 16, so I stepped in and nixed it. He kindly excused himself and made his way out of the house. From that moment, he ceased to exist in my mind. That was until April of the same year. I was on my way home from work when I got a frantic call from my wife. It took a minute to figure out what she was saying, but eventually I realized someone had tried to grab our daughter on her walk home from school. When I made it home, a few minutes later, the cops were already on the scene and talking to her. My wife and I were both so frazzled they asked us to sit calmly and listen while they questioned her. I did my best, but when it came around to identifying the guy, I almost went through the roof. She described how she and another girl were just a few blocks from home. Our house is only 4 blocks from the high school, and a truck pulled up to them. The driver said hello, and my daughter recognized the guy. She walked up to the truck and started talking to him. She said he seemed really nice in the beginning, but when he asked her to go with him and she declined multiple times, he got mad and attempted to pull her into the truck. Only because she fought so hard was she able to get free and run away with her friend. Finally, the officer asked her who the guy was, and she said it was the very same cable repairman she had met just months prior in our home. Now, I was beyond furious. I had treated that kid with respect, and he tried this. I could have thrown him out on his butt when I caught him talking to her, but I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt and think back to how it was when I was young, even after I let him know she was a little young for him and he tried to force himself on her. The officers managed to calm me down and left to continue the investigation. The wife and I did our best to shift our anger into helping our daughter deal with the shock and trauma from the incident. We were all relieved to hear when the scumbag was arrested later that night. He'd been spotted and pulled over by the highway patrol officer that had heard the APB. Although he'd done something very stupid, he was wise enough to take the offer put forth by the district attorney. Hopefully when he comes out in 3 years, he'll have learned to take no for an answer. Since the legal proceedings wrapped up, the rest of the family have made it our goal to help my daughter move past the attack. In addition to attending counseling alone, everyone else has joined her in 2 separate sessions to learn best how to make her healing process go as smoothly as possible. We all plan to be in attendance for her upcoming graduation. Providing her with this show of support in such a hard time is the best way I can think of to let her know we've got her back. There was a time not long ago when her achieving this milestone was in question, but I attribute her same will to fight that saved her that day with driving her to move forward. I've never been prouder to be her father, and I hope she knows I'll always be there for her, no matter the circumstances. October 10th, 1999 was just another ordinary Sunday around our house. After the four of us returned from morning services, I helped Erin, my beautiful wife, finish preparing the last few sides for lunch. Just before noon, the children were called to the table and, as usual, a great meal was had. When we were all satisfied, the kids ran off to do their thing and I assisted Erin in cleaning the table. Once I had completed my husbandly duties, I slipped away to the living room to nap for the few hours. Around 3:45, I was awakened by a phone call from my grandmother, Annie, my dad's mother and the only remaining grandparent or parent on either side of my family. She had raised myself and my sister after our parents had passed, and we were all very close. She asked if I knew any young men that needed work as a repair maintenance man. Her last guy had gotten too old to do the work, and she needed someone new to help around the house every once in a while. I helped her out as much as I could, but between my long hours at work and driving the girls back and forth to their various school-related commitments, I couldn't be relied on to do as much as she sometimes needed. Although I had no one in mind at that very moment, I told her that I'd put the word out and get back to her the next day. My first stop was to Erin. She had nothing for me. A few calls were made to various friends, but they couldn't think of anyone. However, they promised to get back with if the situation was to change. It was a waiting game now, so I plopped myself back down in the chair and dozed off again. A knock came at the door just as I began to drift off. The interruption annoyed me, and for a second I considered not answering it. I decided to go ahead, if just to stop them from banging on the door. When I opened it, I was met by a smiling young man holding business cards. He asked if I needed him to mow the yard. I declined his offer, but just then, Grandmother Annie's request popped into my mind. He was about to walk away until I caught him and asked him if he could do basic repairs, things like fixing broken garbage disposals. When I asked this, his eyes lit up and he said yes. In fact, he had been a Mr. Fix-It in his last job, but unfortunately there was not enough work, so he was forced to fall back on lawn mowing to make ends meet. I briefly looked him over and thought about it in my head for a moment. He seemed like a nice, well-mannered kid. He said thank you, which is more than you can say about most people these days. Finally, I told him to give me a card. I might have a steady job for him. He did, and I promised to let him know in the morning. I let him go, and I returned to the house to enjoy my lazy afternoon. The next morning, I called Miss Annie, my family's name for her, to let her know I may have somebody, and I'd be sending him over that morning. When I hung up with her, I called the young man, Mark, and gave him the address. I told him he'd be doing small repairs and maintenance around my grandmother's house. At the end of each week, he was to come over to my place and I'd pay him. Once the specifics were nailed down, he thanked me and went on his way. With that out of the way, I focused on the task in front of me and put everything else out of my mind. When I returned home that day, I rang Miss Annie up to see how Mark had done. Her report of his work was encouraging. She spoke on more than one occasion of how eager he was to do well and his great attention to detail. This news was very pleasing to hear and assured me I'd made the right decision. Life would continue as normal. That Friday, Mark showed up at 6 p.m. to get his money and thank me, once again, for the opportunity. Dinner was just moments from hitting the table, so I had to cut our talk short. I told him to come around about the same time next week, and he took off, with what I assumed was a song in his heart and a smile on his face. This routine would repeat itself for the next several months. However, as time went by, Mark's smile would fade, and his appreciation seemed to become more of an attitude of entitlement. He got to the point where he wouldn't even say thank you, or anything for that matter, to me. He'd just snatch the money from my hand and walk away. While this behavior ticked me off, I didn't have to like him, as long as he did his job. I hadn't talked to Miss Annie for a while, so one Monday morning, I gave her a ring to see how things were going. She said all was well, but I could tell from her voice something was bothering her. After a few minutes of coaxing, she admitted that Mark hadn't been doing his job as well as he had at first. Once a month or so had passed, he began making comments about money and not getting enough work. Since I was the one paying him, she had no idea how much he was making, so she said nothing. I assured her I was paying him plenty, enough money for a full-time employee as a matter of fact. He had no reason to complain. When she mentioned he would get angry toward her and it scared her, I became a little concerned. Just to calm her fears, I told her I would talk to him that Friday. Even after we hung up with one another, her remark about being scared continued to eat at me. Miss Annie was very special to me, and the idea of her being afraid made me mad. I was determined to nip his behavior in the bud, but it became a problem, but I had to make sure I did so with a clear and calm head. Anger would only serve to exacerbate the situation and breed bitterness between us. I'd cooled off by the time Friday came around. In fact, I was in a pretty good mood. Spring was just beginning to rear its head, and I was looking forward to more sunny and warm days. Mark arrived at the usual time and had the now common scowl across his face. He attempted to snatch the cash from my hand, but before he could, I stopped him and said we needed to talk. He said nothing as I spoke, just stared with an annoyed look. I finished and asked if we had a problem between us and made sure to express how serious I was. All he could say was no and assured me we were cool before he slowly reached out for the money and pulled it from my hand. This time, he at least said thank you before walking away quickly. I couldn't be positive, but things seemed to be clearer, if not better. I wouldn't know for sure until I spoke to Miss Annie that Monday, but I felt optimistic about it. Things at work were very hectic that Monday, so I wasn't able to call Miss Annie until later in the day. Strangely, I got no answer, but figured she was out or busy and I could try again later. Work got busy again, and it was not until I clocked out that I could call her back. Once again, no answer came, but I decided to let it go until the next day. Tuesday morning was much quieter around the office. I had plenty of time to make a call. For the third time, she didn't answer. Now I was becoming scared. So I contacted the police and asked if they could do a wellness check. Miss Annie was almost 80 by then, and the chance of falls were high in people that age. I was told they would and to call back in a few hours. However, it was they who called me back. The tone of the officer's voice uneased me, and he seemed to be dragging out things. This made me mad. I was already on edge from worry. Although I'm not proud of it now, at the time it was understandable. I yelled at him to spit it out, so he did just that. They had done the wellness and found Miss Annie dead. This was unexpected but not shocking. Assuming she died of a heart attack, I asked what the causes were. When he told me that she had been murdered, I blanked out for a minute. Never in my wildest fears had I expected to hear those words. He had to yell out a few more times before I responded, and even then, I felt like I was in a fog. This stuck with me for about an hour, but once I had to tell my family the news, the weight of it knocked me back into reality. The only information the officer could give me at the time was that she appeared to have been attacked by one or more people with hammers or blunt objects. If I would have had my wits about me then, the second I heard the word hammer, I could have told him who it was. But that didn't turn out to be required. I give the cop credit for being kind with his words, even after I'd screamed at him. He could tell from my hemming and hawing what I wanted to ask, and assured me that there were no signs that she had been messed with, if you catch my drift, and I thanked him later for this. The rest of the family took the news almost as hard as I did. Miss Annie had become like a second mother to my wife, and my kids loved her greatly. We'd become very dependent on her after we relocated here, and the thought of her not being around was agonizing. It took a day or two before I remembered Mark and gave him a call. I didn't answer, but after I left a message to contact me ASAP. The longer I thought about it, however, it struck me as odd that he hadn't called me. The first day he received no answer at the door. He should have called me. My confusion would grow into full-blown suspicion once I discovered two important things. The pathologist determined Miss Annie had died sometime before noon on Monday, and perhaps the more scary of the two, Mark was still unreachable. The results came in that Friday morning, and the cops had been to his home twice and called him every day since I mentioned him to them on Wednesday afternoon. I expected to see him that evening to get his pay, but he never showed. This all but cemented his guilt in my mind. I told the police as much, and over the following weeks, they would come to agree with me. Other than having his fingerprints and blood at the scene, everything pointed to him. All they had to do was get him in a room alone, and hopefully he would confess, but just locating him to do this would be a 5-year struggle. Countless tips were sent in, but none would pan out. Finally, on a rainy and cold morning in January of 2006, an arrest would take place across the country in Arizona that would put the search to an end. The Tucson police would be led on a high-speed chase after attempting to pull a man over for expired plates. At the end of the chase, Marco Javier Robles would be apprehended, and our search would finally be over. Marco was quickly extradited back east, and the trial was soon to begin. What we feared would be a long and drawn-out affair ended within the week. The district attorney had offered him a very generous plea, and after a strong recommendation from his attorney, he agreed. He'll have to do at least 25 years, but after that, it's up to the parole board. If I have any sway in the matter, I'll do my best to see that he dies in there. We were left with only one question. Some would say the most important one, perhaps. Why? As a stipulation to his plea, Mark was required to tell why he committed the crime, and in full. According to him, Miss Annie had become very demanding, and he felt he wasn't being paid enough to put up with it. He had been planning on hitting me up for more money once summer came along. However, when he found out she had told me that he was unhappy with his pay, in his eyes, his chance for a raise was ruined. That Monday morning, he was angry about this and confronted Miss Annie about what she had said, and a fight broke out. He claimed she grabbed a poker from the fire set and hit him. In self-defense, he struck her with his hammer, but only did so once. His intent was never to end her life, only to make her stop. Unfortunately, it did just that and more, and my family will never be the same because of it. A less rational man than myself would probably put some, if not all, the blame onto myself for hiring the guy. I, however, am not that man. No one else but Mark is responsible for Miss Annie's death. Any other conclusion would be foolish and a desecration to her memory. If there is anything I would say I feel guilty about, it would be that my children weren't able to spend as much time with her as I did growing up. A better example of selfless love and kindness never existed, and I savor every memory I have of her. I hope I can live up to her example and teach my children to be half the human being she was. I'd never had any problems with my guys until Don Bullard came along. He'd arrived with a raft load of recommendations and obviously knew his stuff. His attitude was the only thing I foresaw being a barrier, but it wasn't bad enough for me to change my mind. His first day on the clock was early May. By June, I was already regretting my decision to hire him. I'd seen my share of idiots in my time, but that kid took the cake. Any words I spoke to him had to be met with some needlessly sarcastic remark. Had he been any other plumber, I'd have fired him. Unfortunately, he just happened to be the best at his job that I'd witnessed in a long time. This was more than likely why he was such a jerk. Even though he'd become such a thorn in my side, I would have never guessed he was capable of what he was about to do. We did a call-out to find the source of a leak, a job that any first-year guy could do. So I told Don to handle it himself. I had far more pressing matters elsewhere, and he was overqualified for the job in the first place. I handed him the paperwork, and he took off in one of the vans. About 4 or 5 hours later, I get a call from the cops. They wanted me to come in and talk to them about a problem one of my guys had just had with a customer and his wife. I was naturally curious about what had happened. It had only been a few hours, and no one had called to make a complaint. Don was the only guy out on a job at the time. I knew it had to be him. It wouldn't be the first time that he had butted heads with a homeowner, but even after I pressed the officer on what had occurred, he wouldn't say over the phone. I wrapped up what I was doing as fast as possible and headed down there. When I arrived, the front desk officer led me down a long hall and into a small office with a couple of messy desks. He asked me to sit down and an officer would be with me in a minute. I twiddled my thumbs and looked around at all the diplomas and pictures on the wall. This went on for a good 10 minutes before a young, skinny kid with a gun on his side came into the room and introduced himself. I told him who I was, and he commenced to lay out the craziest, most shocking story I'd ever heard about someone I knew. Don had arrived at the customer's house and knocked on the door. He mumbled his purpose for being there under his breath. When the male homeowner asked him to speak up, Don repeated himself, but this time in a very loud voice. The homeowner just pointed at the crawl space and walked off. Don disappeared under the house for about half an hour. When he returned, he was wet and covered in mud. The homeowner approached him and asked if he had discovered the source of the leak. Don was said to have screwed up his face and sarcastically answered him with a, "What do you think? Look at me." The remark annoyed the homeowner even more, and he called Don an arrogant little a-hole. This made him fly into a rage, and he began beating the homeowner about his head with a wrench. The homeowner's wife had heard her husband's screams and ran into the room to help him. She began punching Don in the back, and he spun around and returned the favor by punching her in the face over and over until she stopped moving. He must have thought that they were both dead because he sat down on their couch and smoked a cigarette. What he didn't know was that the couple had a young son in the house, and he had called the police when the fight first began. Don was on his way out the door when the officers arrived, and he was taken into custody. The mother was in critical condition at the hospital, but the husband had unfortunately been pronounced at the scene. Most of the information they had at that point was because of Don. The detective said that all through their investigation he had been calm and happy to answer their questions in depth, almost as if he was proud of what he had done. By the time the cop finished the story, I was almost catatonic. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and at first I thought this was all a dream. I pinched myself just to make sure. Even today, when I tell people who knew him what he did, they're shocked almost as much as I was. The detective spent the next hour asking me questions about Don and if I knew why he would do such a thing. There was very little I could give him. Don had always been sarcastic, but never violent in any way. I was out of it for most of the remainder of that day. I still didn't understand what had happened until I relayed the story to my wife and listened to the words that came out of my mouth. This all happened in August of last year. As of the time I'm writing this, Don is scheduled to begin his trial the first week of April. The charges are 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Despite being offered a more than fair plea deal, he's chosen to take it the whole way. Regardless of the result, he'll probably be spending the next 40-plus years in prison. This thought eats me up inside. Even if I couldn't stand the kid, it all just seems like such a terrible waste. Like any reasonable man, my dad took the medium's words with a very small pinch of salt. His girlfriend at the time had drug him down to the palm reader's place to see his future. She claimed upon their meeting that he felt he had some type of danger looming ahead. He didn't put much credit into this psychic mumbo-jumbo, but he loved the girl and was willing to do almost anything to make her happy. The old woman said he was in grave danger and should be very careful where he went. He laughed it off and paid her. Outside of the shop, the girlfriend whined at him for not taking it seriously. He stared into the beautiful blue eyes of the hippie girl and had assured her he would watch out. Inside, however, he was laughing at the unfounded fear she was feeling and had no intent in changing the way he lived his life. This is how he said it all began. He and my mom had just started dating earlier that summer, and he was falling deeply in love with her by the day. Despite her New Age ideas and beliefs, she was a smart girl. They would continue to see one another for several years before he got the guts to pop the question. Mom claims he cried more than she did when she said yes. They moved in together soon after, and the wedding photos showed 2 people very much in love and happy. I didn't make an appearance until late 1980, almost 2 years after the wedding, but no matter my age, they included me in all of their special occasions and holidays. Even before I reached my 12th birthday, Dad had me answering phones and making appointments on my school vacations. It was almost like the 3 of us were put together to make others' lives better and more joyful. At the moment I write this, I have a photo of all of us in front of me. It was taken outside of our camp in Colorado during a summer vacation. Not long after that trip, I began to have a very bad feeling my father was in danger. I'd yet to hear the story of the palm reader, so I was still unaware of my mom's fears, and when I mentioned my feelings to Dad, he laughed them off. I guess at this point I should mention what Dad did for a living, as it had a lot to do with the story. A few years prior to meeting my mom, he'd inherited a garage door business from his father. He had been running it by himself through most of the 70s, but as it became more stressful, he took on a partner to share the workload. When I began working the phones there, he and his partner had already began leaving it to the employees to do the majority of the installations. They would only go out into the field in special circumstances. One of those special circumstances would arise when an older customer requested he and his partner come out and replace one of his automatic door openers. Any other time, he would have handed the job off to one of the installers, but the customer asked for them in particular. This guy wasn't your run-of-the-mill homeowner. He had 25 properties, and they all had my dad's products in them. If he asked for something special, Dad listened. His partner wasn't pleased to hear about it, but knew just like Dad that his customer was business they wanted to keep. Therefore, Dad and his partner Mike dug their tools out of storage in the warehouse and got to work. When they arrived at the property, there was no indication this job would be any more dangerous than any other. Dad set up a ladder and prepared to loosen the bolts holding the main unit to the ceiling. He realized quickly that he'd chosen the wrong size socket and stepped down to get the right one. Mike, who had been at the end of the tracking, standing on a ladder, made a harmless verbal jab at Dad for forgetting the size of a bolt he'd screwed in and out thousands of times. Perhaps to make the process go faster, Mike climbed Dad's ladder and began loosening the bolts himself. He'd made maybe 2 turns on the second bolt when it unexpectedly popped out, causing the other bolt to pop out from its socket. Once this happened, nothing was left to hold up the unit, and it dropped, swinging into Mike's face. The weight of the unit combined with the force in which it struck him caused him to fly backwards uncontrollably onto the floor. This all happened in a matter of about a second. Dad said he felt helpless as he watched it occur. I believe even all these years later, he's still been unable to forgive himself. I probably don't have to tell you, Mike didn't survive. Regardless of the quick response by the EMS, he was most likely gone before he arrived at the hospital. Dad returned to the scene soon after to see if he could discover the reason for the accident. It appeared whoever installed that opener had used very short bolts. When Mike began to loosen them, expecting there to be plenty of threads to hold the unit, his fate was sealed. Dad thought about tracking down the installer but realized it wouldn't bring Mike back. He did, however, return to every one of their rental properties and check the bolts. Fortunately, none of the others had short bolts, and Dad could truly move on and begin to mourn his lost friend. As I sat and listened to him describe the accident, something struck me as strange about it. To me, it appeared as if Dad was the intended target, but Mike walked into it by mistake. When I say target, I don't mean someone conspired to harm him. I mean rather that fate had chosen Dad to die that day instead, but Mike foiled its plans. After he completed the story, I mentioned this to him. He attempted to blow it off as he had when I had mentioned my concerns in the past. But this time something deep inside was stirred up, and he told me the tale of the palm reader. When he was done telling it, he promised me from that day on that he'd never go back out on a job, no matter the customer. He also promised to take my mom's and my concerns more seriously now. I could sense that there were some incidents in his past that helped strengthen his resolve to do this, but he kept those to himself, and I didn't pry. I was just happy to know he was going to be more mindful of his fears and feelings, that I wasn't crazy thinking I had some form of ESP or whatever you choose to call it. The weird looks Mom used to get on her face sometimes right before something bad would happen made much more sense now. It also explains why Dad always said I take after Mom. Not soon after, maybe 5 years later, Dad sold the business to Mike's son and retired. He and Mom bought one of those massive RVs and have toured America for the last 12 years or so. Once or twice a month, we talk with one another over the phone, and My mom admitted to me during one of those discussions that she hadn't had a single bad feeling about Dad in the 16 years since the accident. I didn't have to tell her it was the same for me, as she already knew. It's just another aspect of the connection the three of us have shared all these years. When I was still young, maybe 6 or 7, my folks got the great idea of converting our garage into a family game room. This was in the 80s. The idea of the family game room was really becoming popular, mostly because of the rise of arcades and the availability of arcade games and consoles like the Atari 2600 to the consumer market. It was truly an amazing time to be a kid. Although my parents often used the garage to store things, my dad grew tired of being unable to watch TV because my brother and I were always using it to play games. He had seen a conversion a neighbor had done and decided this would be the best way to get his television back. First, he traveled to the local hardware store and purchased a steel shed to make up for the storage space he'd be losing. Along with a 6-pack of Miller High Life, he spent a few days putting it up in our backyard. He seemed pleased with his work, despite it falling in on itself within a year. His next steps was to find a company able to do the conversion for a fair price. He called every company in the phone book, but they wanted more than he wanted to pay. After asking around, a friend of his recommended a group of guys who had remodeled his kitchen for dirt cheap. Since my dad was a first-class cheapskate, these were the guys for him. They were contacted, and after a lot of haggling, Dad hired them for the job. Dad was in such a hurry to regain control of the TV that he couldn't wait until the spring to start the renovation. As a result, the guys had to use space heaters in order to be comfortable working in the Kansas winter. For the start, these guys were nothing but trouble. When they did show up to the house, they did very little and often called it a day by 3 p.m. My dad had to complain several times. Once or twice, he even had to make them redo some piece of shoddy work. If I remember right, my mother tried to get him to fire the guys and hire a new company, but regardless of all the headaches, Dad was a miser to the bone. Eventually, he would be forced to get a new set of contractors. However, this was only because a near-deadly disaster was forcing him to. One day, Billy, my little brother, and I would be put to bed just like any other evening. At some point in the middle of the night, my mother would shake me awake. She was yelling and had a very panicked look on her face. I slowly started to rise when I began to smell smoke. Mother was next door yelling at my brother. It wasn't long before the smoke caused me to start choking and coughing. I remember I was putting on my robe when my mother came running back into my room, carrying Billy on her shoulder. I don't think he was even awake yet. She pushed me out of my room and ran down the hall towards the front door. My dad was standing in the foyer. He must have been waiting for us. The house had filled with a thick black smoke by then, but I couldn't see any fire. This changed once we all made it out to the front lawn. I stood with the rest of them watching the flames engulfing the house and illuminating the neighborhood. Fire trucks arrived a minute later and we all got checked out by the paramedics. They fought the fire for over an hour, but the house was already done for. We would be living in a motel for the next 6 months or more. After a week after the fire, Dad got the report that stated it had been started by a faulty space heater in the garage. I can only imagine how furious he was to read this. This still didn't stop him from wanting to hire the yahoos back to rebuild the whole house. My mother put her foot down at this point, though. When she threatened to take Billy and I and move in with her parents, Dad folded and hired a very reputable company to do the job. I'm suspicious he only chose them because he wasn't paying for it. The check from the insurance company did. He probably would have found another group of cowboy builders to do the job and kept the extra money, but I don't think he thought of that. I love the man, but Jesus. The work was completed rather quickly. My parents chose to have the new house rebuilt in almost the exact same design as the original. The one major difference was the construction of a large game room at the back. The family would spend the majority of our next 10 years in there, even Dad. The garage was put back to work storing things and the shed left to collapse. It's still there, a big pile of rusty steel, all these years later. I hadn't been working for myself very long when I got a call to rewire a small house by the new owner. She expressed a fear to me that the old, outdated wiring could be a fire hazard, and I agreed. This homeowner just happened to be a young and beautiful woman, not to mention newly single one. Despite being very attracted to her, I kept things professional between us. The large amount of work I had to do meant I had to return to the home every day for about a week. Much of the time I was present in the house, we were in separate rooms and only spoke 2 or 3 times in the entire 5 days. Nothing untoward ever took place. I knew this. She knew this. I only wish her ex would have known this. Friday morning arrived and I only had a few small things to finish. The homeowner, Crystal, had paid me the day before. My plan was to wrap up the job and move on. I'll be honest, I had plans to contact her in the month or 2 and ask her out, but for now, I had 1 foot out the door. When I first heard the loud noises upstairs, I was in the basement cleaning up my work area. Without thinking, I ran upstairs to see what had caused it. Unfortunately for me, I turned the corner just in time to come eye to eye with a stranger with a gun. I froze, and he used that opportunity to move closer. Now he was so close I could smell the oil in the gun. It was aimed directly at my face. Crystal ran up behind me and screamed when she saw the gunman. I closed my eyes tight, expecting him to blow my brains out when she did this. Instead, I hear him begin yelling at her, and in return, she began screaming his name and telling him to get out. It was obvious now that they had known each other. I wasn't sure if this was good or bad for me, but I stayed right where I was. The yelling soon stopped, and he told me to step back, slowly into the living room behind me. Crystal, who had been behind me all this time, joined me. We were then ordered to sit on the couch and say nothing. This was when he began calling me a home-wrecking a-hole. This confused me until he followed up by asking how long I'd been banging Crystal. We both denied this, but were quickly told to shut up. He said there was no reason to deny it. He'd been watching the house all week and he knew I'd been over every day. I was boiling over, wanting to explain while I was there, but I was afraid of being shot. Crystal asked him if she could explain the situation and he agreed. To begin, she introduced him to me. He was Victor, her ex-husband. Victor's face tensed up when she said this, but she continued. Then she introduced me to Victor by explaining I was an electrician who she had hired to redo the wiring. Her and I had no personal relationship whatsoever. He interjected himself into the conversation and said that was BS because I didn't have any signs on my truck. Sensing it may be my turn to speak, I countered his claim by explaining I was new in business for myself, and I hadn't had the spare cash to have the signs made. But if he looked in the basement, he'd see my tool belt and supplies in a pile. Victor had a look of doubt on his face, but his body language betrayed his inner curiosity. I said nothing else, allowing the possibility to turn around in his mind. What seemed like a good idea at first began to worry me. He could take us down there and shoot us and get away, while the neighbors would be none the wiser. To this day, I'm not sure how, but Crystal must have read my mind. When Victor agreed and waved us to the door, we did what we were told. In my head, I'm crapping myself this whole time thinking I was about to die. Unknown to me, Crystal had a plan for me to get away. I can only assume she was confident Victor wouldn't shoot her. So as we approached the door to the stairs, he stood there with a pistol locked on me and waved me by. I complied and Crystal followed. However, instead of going down, she jumped on Victor as she passed him. He had his body facing down the stairs and was watching me, so she nailed him square on his side and they fell to the floor. Crystal wasn't a particularly large girl and Victor was about average size for a man, but somehow she tackled him like a football player 3 times her size. I just happened to be looking back when she did this. As soon as they hit the ground, she began yelling for me to run while hitting and slapping him over and over. Victor was still holding the gun in his hand, but he was holding both hands up to protect his face from her elbows. He didn't look like he was about to shoot, so I ran back up the 2 stairs and out of the house. And you can call me a coward all you want, but I wager you probably do the same. The door had been broken off the hinges when Victor forced himself in, so I ran straight out and across the street to the neighbor's house and started banging on the door. The homeowner, an older gentleman, threw it open and I began yelling about a man with a gun before he could say a word. He opened the screen right away and let me in, closing the door behind him. The phone was on the wall next to us and he grabbed it off the hook and handed it to me. I dialed as fast as I could and gave the operator the facts. I answered her questions and waited for the sound of gunshots, but instead heard the muffled screams of Crystal outside. She'd gotten away somehow and was running from door to door yelling for help. When I looked out the window for her, I saw a woman and a man run out of one of the nearby houses and bring her in. Confident she was now safe, I began begging the operator to get the cops on scene before Victor could escape. She assured me that they were close. Sure enough, 2 cars, soon followed by 2 more, pulled up outside the house and the cops rushed inside. I watched with bated breath for them to come out. I had no idea Victor was still inside, but thankfully, a minute or 2 later, they came out with him in handcuffs. This is when I finally came out and introduced myself as the caller and told them what had occurred. Crystal and the couple came out and joined us not long after. I looked over and asked her if she was okay. She said yes, but I could see a bleeding cut on the webbing of her left hand. It wasn't until a few hours later that she told me she had been fighting him for the gun and he must have pulled the trigger, but fortunately for her, she had grabbed it high up and the hammer came down on the webbing of her hand, preventing it from firing. At some point, she clawed at his eyes and he dropped it. This was when she made a break for it, hoping she wasn't going to be shot in the back as she ran away. The police told us while the paramedics were checking us out that Victor was just sitting on the floor crying when they came in. He didn't fight or argue as they handcuffed him and loaded him into the car. They bandaged up Crystal's hand and after 2 hours took off. I volunteered to repair her door as much as possible until it could be replaced, and the couple that had helped her invited her to stay with them for the night. She accepted. On the way to my truck, I thanked the neighbor once again for helping us and gave him my card. I told him to call me anytime he needed any electrical work done, and it would all be done on the house. It was the least I could do. Crystal and I wouldn't see each other again until the trial. I showed up to testify and stayed around to watch her testimony. It carried on for another week until the jury came back with a guilty verdict. A few months later, Victor was given a 10-year sentence agreed upon by the DA and ultimately ended up doing 7 and some change. I don't hold any ill will against him after all these years. I can only pray he feels the same and has bettered himself. The trial was the last time I'd seen Crystal and I haven't spoken to her since. As you can imagine, it didn't feel right to ask her out after all that happened. I hope she's doing okay now and knows how thankful I really am for risking her life to save mine. That was far more than I would expect a person to do for someone they barely knew. And if you're wondering, yes, I did get a call from that neighbor and I did do some work for him for free. And I will again. He didn't have to help me either. In these days and times, you never know if that person asking for help outside your door is really in danger or just trying to bait you. It's a sad thing to say, but a fact, nonetheless. This is something that happened long before I was born, but still gives me chills every time I hear it. To provide a bit of context, my grandpa Martin had just returned from fighting in the Korean War. After all the horrors he experienced, he was ready to start a family and put it all behind him. He and Granny Martin took all the money they'd been saving for Grandpa's pay and bought a 2-bedroom house a few blocks from elementary school. The World War I era house had its share of problems, but none were as severe as the plumbing. Roots from the many oak trees crisis crossed the road, busting and blocking up the ancient pipes. Now, Grandpa was a near master when it came to working with his hands, but he had neither the knowledge nor the time to do all the labor it would take to resolve the problem. It just happened that Granny Martin had plumbers on her side of the family, very well-respected ones, in fact. Unfortunately for them, Grandpa had differences with them in the past, and he was determined not to put any of his own money in their pockets. All through the spring and early summer of '55, Grandpa called plumbers one by one, but none would take on a job so large for what he had wanted to pay. He was very near to attempting it all himself when Granny confessed she had went to her family behind his back and they had agreed to do the job for his price, but only as a favor to her. She would mention to me later how she knew Grandpa would be furious at what she'd done, but the state of the pipes was driving them both crazy. He certainly was angry at hearing this, but Granny reminded him no one else was volunteering to take it on, and he had to swallow his pride and go along with it. The first week in July, Granny's uncle, his son, and their men showed up at the house to start the work. I won't bore you with the details on how the argument started, but I will say it escalated quickly. Before I get into the specifics of what occurred, I want to warn you, what you are about to hear is graphic and may upset those who have been victims or witnesses to violence in their past. You've been warned. I don't want to repeat what was said, but suffice to say it was something men usually won't let go, especially men of that time. Grandpa took exception with what the nephew said and decked him. The nephew, knowing he was outmatched, chose to back off. However, his father was furious at seeing his son get his butt kicked and attacked Grandpa with a pocket knife. Grandpa had his back turned when the attack began and took one stab to the back. He quickly turned around to defend himself but got 2 more stabs to the midsection before the knife blade thankfully snapped off. Unfortunately, Granny's uncle wasn't done. He picked up a nearby pipe wrench and smashed Grandpa across the jaw, then the head several times. If he thought Grandpa was going down, he was wrong. After all, the man had been bayoneted twice and shot once but didn't die. Him being angry just made him more dangerous. Grandpa was holding himself up on one knee and noticed a nearby length of pipe that the plumbers had been using and picked it up. Granny's uncle had stopped the attack for a moment, but when he saw Grandpa rise back to his feet, he swung again. This time, Grandpa blocked his arm and connected with his own weapon across his attacker's head. Granny described the noise as the pipe made contact like a hammer smashing a watermelon. Her uncle remained on his feet and tried to renew his attack, but Grandpa smashed him twice more across the head and he dropped to the ground, never to rise again. Everyone present was understandably upset, but the violence was over for the day. Grandpa would lose consciousness just minutes later. Even when he did regain his wits, the next day he was unable to speak to the police because of his wired jaw. The knife wounds turned out to be not that serious. The broken jaw was not the worst of his injuries, however. Doctors were forced to put a plate in his head to replace the pieces of skull lost when he was struck there. The district attorney wanted to make an example of him, so, upon release from the hospital, the cops were there to arrest him. The most serious charges were felony assault and second-degree murder. He was miraculously released on bail only because he was the family's only source of income. I imagine in a large town or city, he would have to spend the next year or more in the county jail. In some ways, it was a more civilized time. The trial did finally happen, and because witnesses testified on his behalf, the jury decided Grandpa was acting in self-defense and found him not guilty. Granny Martin's support for her husband would ensure a rift would remain between her and the rest of her family until just recently. The horrible state of their home's plumbing, which started all this mess in the first place, was resolved when they sold it to another young couple. The new buyers were all aware of the problem and had hired a company from out of town to finish the work. They must have done a good job. I believe the couple still lives there to this day. Grandpa and Granny stayed in an apartment a few years before Mom was born, and they purchased a house in the same neighborhood as before. Grandpa would go on to live another 55 years without even getting as much as a cold. In the end, it was a stroke in his sleep that took him. Granny Martin is still alive and kicking at the age of 80. I was proud to know this man, but I don't have to agree with how he handled the situation to love him. Granny and I often reminisce about him, and recently while doing so, I had her recount the incident to me, so I could write it down and share it with all you listeners. I hope the way I wrote it properly conveys the feelings of unease I feel every time I hear it. I try to portray each man without making either out to be the good guy. Even Grandpa would probably acknowledge that he could have handled things better in the beginning. If any moral could be taken away from this story, I'd think it would be that we should try to talk through our problems before we resort to violence, and if we do so, I think the world would be better for it. Don't you? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember...